welcome to Critical Conversations, a discussion which bridges interdisciplinary perspectives on issues posing critical challenges to humanity. Today's session is entitled Building Resilient Futures, COVID, Climate, and the Economy. My name is Anne Fitzgerald, Director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and together with the Ditchley Foundation, we are delighted to be hosting this first of 3 annual Critical Conversations. Welcome to all of you in the audience today, and there are many of you. If you have any questions which you wish to direct towards the panelists, please use the Zoom function at the bottom of your screen via the Q&A function on your Zoom panel. And we will do our best to channel these questions to the appropriate panelists, particularly in the latter part of today's session. We are honored and privileged today to welcome 3 global thought leaders on issues related to climate, economic, and social policy. Diana Fox-Carney is a public policy expert with a strong focus on energy and climate change. She recently returned to Canada from the UK, where she led programming at Pi Capital, London's top convening organization. She has held leadership roles at Canada 2020 and the Institute for Public Policy Research in London, and is current or past board member of several not-for-profit organizations in the development and climate space. Her current work is around negative emissions technologies and pathways to net zero carbon. John Hancock works at the World Trade Organization in Geneva, Switzerland, where he has served as Senior Policy Advisor to the Director General, Representative to the IMF and the World Bank, and Head of Policy Development. He spearheaded the launch of the World Trade Organization's Aid for Trade initiative, as well as recent joint initiatives on investment in e-commerce. Prior to joining the World Trade Organization, John was Senior Advisor to Canada's Trade Minister. He holds a PhD from Cambridge, has written and spoken frequently on international issues and guest lectures for many universities, including Cambridge, Columbia, and Georgetown universities. William, or Bill White, is currently a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute in Toronto, Canada. Until April of 2018, he was chairman of the Economic and Development Review Committee at the OECD in Paris. In his capacity as chairman, Bill also contributed to meetings of WP1 and the Economic Policy Committee at the OECD. As well, he was for 4 years a member of the Issuing Committee, advising the German Chancellor on G20 issues. Previous to these positions, Bill has served as Special Advisor to the Canadian Minister of Finance, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, and Head of the Monetary and Economic Department for the Bank of International Settlements. He's widely published on issues related to monetary and financial stability, as well as the process of international cooperation in these areas. And to facilitate today's session is Professor Jatin Nathwani. Jatin is founding executive director of the Waterloo Institute for Sustainable Energy and professor at University of Waterloo. As the inaugural Ontario Research Chair in Public Policy for Sustainable Energy, he's led research initiatives on accelerating energy transitions for a zero carbon economy. He co-directs the Global Change Initiative, and he co-leads the STEM for Global Resilience cluster at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Over to you, Jatin.
Hello, and a warm welcome to each one of you. I'm delighted you're able to join us for this inaugural special event at the BSIA to foster critical conversations to help shape our collective global futures. Our panelists, Diana Fox-Carney, John Hancock, and Bill White, bring a unique set of perspectives and insights on this topic. How do we build resilient futures with the Damocles sword of climate risk hanging over us and the present trauma of COVID, delivering in essence deaths, distress, and disruption to our livelihood and the functioning of the global economic system? Climate risk has often been referred to as a wicked problem. Its initial and boundary conditions are not known and knowable in advance because we have fundamentally altered planetary boundary conditions. COVID, on the other hand, is a shorter-term challenge. In principle, subject to mitigation, although its untimely and unruly arrival, like a banquo's ghost at Macbeth's feast, has unhinged many of our long-held beliefs. The longer-term social and economic consequences and ramifications of COVID remain unknown. So in light of these compounding challenges at the intersection of climate, COVID, and the economy, it is truly timely to explore pathways for workable solutions. So let me now turn to our panelists to help us navigate through these challenges. We have heard many calls to build back better, meaning creating an economic recovery that prioritizes green energy or clean energy transitions towards a cleaner global economy. Assuming the will exists to achieve this transition, what do we have to do differently? What have we learned? John, COVID is in many ways a predictable and a predicted crisis. Why do we fail to prepare for disasters like the financial crisis or pandemics that we are warned about? Have we learned anything from COVID that could make us more prepared for other unpredictable surprises like climate change?
Yeah, that's exactly the right question, and it sort of goes to the heart of where we are right now. I'm not fond of quoting Donald Rumsfeld, the former Secretary of Defense, but he once spoke of the unknown unknowns and then the known unknowns, or the what another academic has called the predictable surprises. Why is it that we are warned of certain things? We're warned of disasters like pandemics. We're warned, of course, repeatedly of global warming, but we do nothing to prepare for them, and we fail to act. In this case of COVID, for example, no one could say we didn't see it coming. At least no one could say we didn't see a pandemic coming. Bill Gates has spoken for years about coming pandemic being the next great crisis, as have dozens of other commentators. International institutions and national bodies from WHO, the National Security Council in the United States have put this in their top 10 list of global crisis, a coming pandemic. We had warnings in our immediate future. We had the SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. We had two major influenza outbreaks. We had MERS and as another coronavirus example. So it's not like there weren't precedents for this crisis. And of course, at least in Europe and North America, we had several months, if not longer, to see what was unfolding in China. Lots of images on the screen, and we didn't act. There's lots of possible psychological explanation, nature of the human condition that explains why we don't act on predictable things. The normalcy bias, the idea that things are always going to go back to normal and that normality will prevail. So, we may see danger on the horizon, but we figure the world is going to revert to the mean or to the average. We're optimists at heart, optimists particularly about ourselves. We believe that, it might happen to other people, but it's not going to happen to us. And we're herd creatures, right? We kind of look around to others for guidance on what we should be doing. And if everyone else doesn't seem to be panicking, we don't panic either. This is maybe where there's room for improvement, especially room for, having a government and institutions that sensitize and educate the public about coming problems or potential problems far more actively and thoroughly. And probably it's also an argument for just resilience or contingency protection, creating societies that are more shock absorbers. So even if we can't pinpoint the crisis, we know something's coming and we're prepared for it.
It gets us to the heart of resiliency. Diana, what have we learned during the COVID that is relevant for climate policy?
Thank you, Jatin, and thanks for having me on the panel today, and to everyone for joining. I think John was absolutely right when he talked about why we don't pay attention. And I think what we've seen now is a real-time discontinuity. We are all understanding that massive change is possible, changes in the way we live our lives and the way the economy functions. So we no longer have some of the excuses that John talked about, which is one thing. I think to start off, I would talk about some of the things that are similar between the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, and that's where we can learn lessons, as well as them being systemic risks and non-linear risks. We've heard a lot about exponential growth of COVID. They're very fast moving and they're very regressive in their impact. So they affect the poorer people generally worst. In terms of what we can learn in our responses, we know that to address either of these problems, we have to bring everyone together. They are collective issues. We need collective responses, and governments need to talk openly with populations in order to get them complying with the type of restrictions that are being imposed on them, which I think actually, having come from the UK and now being in Canada, that's a lot easier in Canada than it is in the UK. People here do more or less like to be told what to do by governments, it seems, which is certainly not true. And obviously the US is at the other end of the spectrum. But I think it's related to that. It's also shown us the importance of competence within government and effective governments. And I think many of the discrepancies between death rates in different countries come down to the competence of government. So I think that we have learned that we need good people in charge. And I will point out that the UK just completed a Citizens Climate Assembly, and I'll come back to that later on. But one of the key recommendations from that group, a diverse group of people, they said that it was imperative that there is a strong, clear leadership from government. And that has to be the case in climate too. And I don't want to hog my time here, but I think the other issue that I will point up at this point is the question of how we integrate science and policy making, which is relevant across both of these crises. The public's relationship with science is complex. We've discovered that people don't really understand how much certainty we should expect from science and how scientific findings should or should not translate into policy advice. And I think these are very complex issues that are relevant in both the spaces we're talking about. So I'll come back to a number of those later on, but don't want to spend too much time now. Thank you.
Thanks, Diana. You raised a number of very germane points, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of those as part of the conversation. Bill, if I may turn to you, in what ways would a sustainable model of economic growth differ from the current, let's call it, unsustainable practice?
Well, it's interesting. When we had the beginning of the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009, previously all the emphasis was on strong growth. And after we had the crisis, what was interesting was the change in the objectives set out by the G20, where it went from being just sort of strong growth to strong, sustainable, and inclusive growth. And the sustainable had two components. It was sort of had something to do with the economic growth, but it also had something to do with the environment. But we've had this statement of objectives, but there's a long way to go in actually implementing measures to go from where we are to where we want to be. And I would put the finger on four things. I think there's four frameworks that really need fixing. The first one is the policy framework, the macro framework. The second one is the production framework. The third one is the political framework, which has to do with inclusion and income equality and that sort of thing. And the fourth thing has to do with the institutional framework. And all of those things really need substantial change. So when you think about the policy framework, we use monetary policy and fiscal policy every time there's a problem without thinking about structural change. And so the upshot is debt levels keep going up and up and up to what are now unsustainable levels. And I call those policy preconditions. We've shot ourselves in the foot. On the production side, I think the biggest thing, and this goes back to climate, is that we've produced for years and years without producers having to take into account the price of the pollution, the climate warming, and all that sort of stuff. So that's all got to change too. There's got to be a price put on carbon, et cetera, et cetera. On the political framework, there it's the question of inclusion, that we've relied for far too long on trickle-down theory, and it just simply doesn't work. And both governments and companies have got to pay much more attention to those that are, in a certain sense, being left behind. And lastly, at the institutional level, and I'll finish with this, and we see it with respect to climate change in particular. At the level, with respect to institutional change, the state is still very important. And yet what we know is that most of the things that are causing us trouble are global in nature, and they transcend the state. And we also know that in terms of getting things done, things get done at a much more local level than the state. And so I think we need a kind of barbell revolution in terms of how things are governed. So there's a lot of issues out there that need to be changed to go from being unsustainable to being sustainable.
Thank you, Bill, for identifying those 4 key frameworks, and we need to have a much stronger focus and attention on the interconnected aspects across those frameworks to be able to solve this set of complex problems. Maybe I'll turn slightly to a different question. So can we reconcile the economy and the environment? Is a sustainable development possible, particularly in the context of a global pandemic, and what needs to change to achieve it? Diana, does the quest for resilience in the health, climate, economic space lead us in the same direction or not?
So I would argue that we don't really have a choice. We have to find a way to make these things congruent. And I think for a long time, we were presented with a false dichotomy between the economy and the climate. And people were kind of forced to make a choice when there wasn't really, that was a false choice. We have to find ways to reconcile the two. I think this is obviously a complex issue. It's not, you can't just say, yes, the two are, marvelously compatible. There are ways in which building resilience in our systems will take us in the right direction. There are also ways that it won't. I mean, at the simplest level, if we are reducing the kind of narrow economic efficiency of supply chains and just-in-time supply chains, for example, we're likely to end up using more materials, having a little bit more, contingencies, stocks in place, this kind of thing, which is not inherently good for the planet if we're kind of over-collateralizing in some spaces. On the other hand, we have seen that we can change our behaviors in a sort of unprecedented way, which allows us to make some kind of, the type of changes that we, as I say, we didn't think we might be able to make, but now we've seen that people can, stop in their tracks, turn around and go in a different direction. And so that gives us more opportunity to align the two. And I think obviously, again, at a fairly simple level, we can enforce alignment, or governments, when they're handing out stimulus packages and support, can, for example, to the private sector, can put green conditionality behind them. They can, it's already been shown in most of the economic analysis that the jobs packages that come out of green stimulus are actually more positive than traditional stimulus packages. So it's estimated by McKinsey that it's a sort of 3-to-1 ratio in jobs terms for green stimulus to traditional brown/gray stimulus packages. So I would say we can do it, but it's not simple, and we have to think very carefully through the implementation aspects.
Thanks, Diana, for pointing out that this is not, climate, economy, and health is not an either-or proposition, but that the alignment has to be fostered through some very integrative thinking. Bill, if that's the case, then what analytical challenges do you think we face in trying to devise the kinds of policies to ensure a more sustainable, a resilient future for humanity?
Well, I think you're spot on to point out the fact that there's multiple challenges here that are going to have to be dealt with at the same time. And I would say at the level of sort of analytical insights, the most important point is to recognize that we have a whole bunch of interdependent systems. And we have to start thinking in terms of systems, not silos. We have to have a multidisciplinary approach to all of these problems. And we haven't had that up until now. People have been sort of digging their respective holes deeper and deeper without thinking about the fact that the things that they're doing to optimize their systems, let's say economic growth, are things that are actually destabilizing the other systems. So that's what we really have to come to grips with, is these interdependencies. It's that old line of Tolstoy, remember at the beginning of Anna Karenina? All happy families are happy in the same way, and all unhappy families are unhappy in different ways. You need a lot of things to come together to make it all work. And that's why when you start thinking about the inevitable trade-offs, okay, that you're seeking a number of different objectives here. For example, efficiency on the one hand today, but sustainability tomorrow. But when you think about those trade-offs, you've got to recognize that there really are trade-offs, and we've worked on the basis of all things are possible, but it's not true. There are trade-offs we'll have to make. And it's not just, there's complications associated with that because we don't know enough. I mean, you made a reference earlier on to wicked problems. We don't know enough about initial conditions and how things are changing in order to be able to do that. So we're going to have to be very careful. And the other thing, it's an analytical challenge, and I see this mostly on the economic side, well, other areas as well, is that what makes policy more difficult is that many of the things that we can do not only have impacts in different realms than the realm that we're first thinking about, okay, the interconnected systems, but the policy effects are different over time. So the example I would give, really, I mentioned it earlier on, is with respect to macroeconomic policy. If you're always searching for the quick fix in terms of spend the money and print the money, then maybe there's longer term consequences that eventually come back and haunt you. So those are the big things, the interdependencies over space and the complications posed by the time dimension.
Thank you, Bill. John, I'll come to you now, and maybe a slightly different take on the same question. So how do we secure global leadership, whether on the economy, COVID, or climate, for example, when this fundamental underlying facet of our lives, this is the notion of public trust in whether it's politicians, experts, elites, and so on, is at such a low ebb? What is it that around the trust question that do we need to really think our way through to get there?
That's another great question. I wish I had a great answer, although I do think it's a major problem. I read in the Financial Times yesterday where back in March in the UK, roughly 70% of people were open to the idea of having a vaccine or administering a vaccine to themselves to deal with the crisis. That's now dropped to below 40%. I mean, there's sort of huge skepticism about the efficacy of vaccine, conflicting news stories about the safety of vaccine and how trials are going. So it has real world consequences. And of course, we see it in the debate about climate change, where, especially in certain societies, opinions are very polarized on the subject. And if you throw into the mix the economic costs, how we deal with a recovering economy, COVID, and climate change, sometimes the opinions become even more polarized. I don't think personally we're going to go back to a world where people have noticeable and enduring deference for authority figures. I just don't see that happening in today's internet, digitally driven world. It's got to lie with us, I think. And this is where my answer becomes fuzzy. It fundamentally lies in some form of, it's education or self-empowerment through knowledge. I'm reminded there's this Carl Sagan quote where he says, "We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology." That's kind of an extreme form, and I'd argue, one of the great things about COVID is we certainly have scaled up our knowledge of virology and epidemiology and all the sciences associated with this virus. Maybe there's a lesson in that, but I do think it's not going to be a top-down answer. It's going to be more of a bottom-up answer.
Thank you. But trust will remain a pretty critical component of how we can evolve practical solutions. Let me shift the question a little bit, and the question along these lines. So, can we make the transition, this global transition, without a massive disruption to our societies, including in avoiding, let's call it, significant unemployment in sectors of the economy that are carbon intensive? How do we ensure a fair transition? Those are sort of important related questions. Bill, what costs do you expect will be involved in moving to a more sustainable, resilient economy, and who might be expected to bear the burden of that cost?
Well, spot on the question. I mean, there's going to be a lot of costs involved in moving from the unsustainable to the sustainable. And there's going to be a lot of risks involved too. And I see them, I identify the sort of 4 areas where I think we need major reforms. And with respect to each one of them, you can see that there's costs and risks involved. So when you start thinking about macro and the sort of policy framework, there I think the most important thing is the cost to establish beliefs that I think our policymakers have worked on the basis of models of the world, economic models of the world that are actually simple and essentially linear. And what we have to accept is that the world is complex, it's adaptive, the fundamental philosophical, epistemological model of the economy and perhaps of the world is just wrong, the one that we've been working on the basis of. And that's got to change. And that's going to be hard for a lot of policymakers to deal with, because in effect, what they've got to understand is that they don't really understand and they don't really control. And they've got to be more humble in terms of the way they approach problems. And maybe echoing John sort of being a bit fuzzy, how they become both more humble and more brave at the same time is going to be a real challenge. The second thing, of course, is this business about the production system and raising carbon taxes in that range of territory. First off, we have the stranded assets problem, which is going to potentially wipe trillions of dollars off the value of companies, et cetera. And that could have real implications for financial stability. And that's now very well known. So that's going to be a problem. And of course, it will have implications for stock prices and things of that character. So that's another issue. The distributional questions, the political questions, how do we get a juster, more equitable society? Clearly what that means is that the compensation provided to richer people has got to go down, whereas the compensation provided to and the safety nets provided for poor members of the society have to go up. And of course, that's going to gore somebody's ox, and presumably it's going to be the richer people, but that's all got to be done. One can only hope, when you look back on the history of sort of distributional changes, that richer people will recognize that it's their, how can I say, that that if they don't make changes that are really required to maintain political stability, they wind up losing far more than if they made the changes that were required to maintain political stability. And then, of course, we get into this last question about the institutional framework, and my suggestion, we need to move to a kind of barbell approach to things. There, the particular group that's going to get gored are going to be the nation states. And as we've seen, particularly in the United States recently with America First and all that stuff, lots of people in positions of power won't want to give it up. But that's something that's going to have to be done, I think, if we're going to get to a stage where we've got a global vision and then local sort of institutions to actually make change happen. So there's going to be a lot of costs. There are a lot of risks. But I think, as Diana said earlier on, the reality is that we don't have any choices about these matters. We've got to pursue all of these things with all the vigor and the care that we can.
Thank you. You raised the distributional question. I'll come back to that in a moment with Diana. But before that, John, maybe a slightly different tack here. So we have internet-powered movements from Greta Thunberg to Black Lives Matter. This is a driving global agenda in ways that leaders' summits and communiques don't. Now, so is this decentralization of power, in your view, positive or a negative development? And is there promise here that it can be harnessed to deliver real change? Your thoughts on that?
Another good question. This maybe adds to one of to Diana's list of things we just have to deal with. We're not going to change it. I am struck by, anecdotally, how powerful this sort of digitalized, empowered world is. Here in Europe, and I think to some extent in North America, coronavirus was an abstract phenomenon until we had pictures of people dying in Italian hospitals and internet stories of doctors choosing between life and death for patients, and images of the military being moved into cities to deal with the health crisis. These visuals and this movement was what shifted opinion dramatically across the board here in Europe. I mean, the UK changed position 180 degrees. Switzerland, where I live, tightened up. I see the same phenomenon on climate change, whether we're watching images of burning wildfires in San Francisco or glaciers melting. And of course, when that's harnessed by a movement with a clear agenda and an articulate spokesperson like Greta, it's an irresistible force. I don't have a simple answer to this, but including at the international level, but certainly at the national level, at the local level, this is a force that we need to find a way to channel that into positive outcomes, because I think the one cost I see of this is that not only does this movement seem irresistible and explosive, it subsides very rapidly too. That, in one month we're deeply concerned about COVID, and then we move to Black Lives Matter, and then we move to another issue. And it's very difficult for governments to keep up, but it's also very difficult for governments to actually execute a policy and implement in the timeframes we're talking about. So these are challenges. Having said that, they're not going to go away.
Thank you. Maybe I will now turn to Diana on another question Bill raised, which is, how can we craft a COVID climate framework, let's say, that reduces economic inequality, one of the few defining features of today's economic landscape that seems to harness a lot of political angst and anxiety. The whole question of social and economic inequality. Any thoughts on that?
So it's my contention that economic inequality is a driver of many of the problems that we've address, that we've mentioned, in particular, the lack of trust and the lack of ability to bring people along in collective action. So, if we take COVID, but this is also true of climate, and I mentioned this already, it's hitting the poorer segments of our societies hardest. It's hitting, the unemployment is across the board, but a lot at the lowest levels, unskilled labor. The ethnic communities in almost every country have been hardest hit. People who live in crowded housing, etc. You can go into detail, and I think there hasn't been sufficient recognition of that fact in terms of the responses and how we can address COVID. So we have to, we certainly have to provide universal health care. I mean, that's okay in Canada, but in countries that don't have healthcare for the people who are being hit hardest, of course, the virus is going to continue to spread its tentacles through society. And we have to recognize that we're all in this together. So if the virus is running riot in certain communities, it's always going to, the borders are permeable, it's always going to get out. So it's in all our interests to try and address the inequalities with regard to living conditions and economic abilities of certain groups. But I think more importantly, the economic inequality has been a driver, as I say, of this lack of willingness to be part of a collective solution. So if we're going to bring our societies together, if we're going to get over this fragmentation, we have to think about bringing people in. And it's not only economic, it's in terms of being listened to, its voices, it's feeling represented, looking at the people who are making decisions and seeing yourself in those spaces. And I would say that these are hard things to address along with COVID. There is a temptation in a very immediate short-term crisis to kind of pile the money in and not think about the distributional consequences. But it would be my contention that they have to be front and center, and that there are, we do have measures, including just raising, just switching around our taxation system that are familiar. We know they work, and we've been going in the wrong direction in most countries, most developed countries, for the past couple of decades. So we can readily turn those around. And I guess but I would point out two things. One is the geographical issues around inequality. So I think one problem that we have not cracked, and to me is a bit of a holy grail, is turning distressed economic communities into vibrant, green, new economy communities. So there is, and of course this is a big issue in Canada, but it's a big issue in most countries. Certainly in the UK, there are communities in the north of England that came out of coal mining and heavy industry, have not really prospered in the new economy. We do not have a way yet, a sort of cookie cutter approach, if ever there was one, would be wonderful, to go to a community and say, we know that your jobs are going because of, perhaps they were all in the hospitality industry and they've been hit by COVID, or perhaps they're in high carbon emitting areas, but we can assure you that we have a plan for putting you all back to work in a wonderfully new, clean, vibrant way. We can try, and I think we need to do a lot more to kind of learn the lessons, but there is no immediate solution. And there is also an issue, maybe now is not the time to get into it, of some of the discrepancy between the jobs that are being lost, which I think is actually a bigger issue on COVID, where a lot of the jobs that are being lost are in service industry and other things, and now female jobs. This has been called the she session, and we're not necessarily going to replace that type of job with a new, clean, green economy. If we retrofit houses, it's not going to be people who used to work in the mall who are going to be doing it. So I do think we have to think of the mapping of communities and jobs, and try and be more creative about that, and mindful of where the gaps are. So yeah. Very last thing I want to say on this point is, it's not just the poorest communities that are being hit. But I do think this is an underlying issue that needs to be addressed.
Well made point. Socioeconomic inequality is and will be a hard nut to crack. And so that takes me to the next question. What then are some of the structural barriers inhibiting whether it's the transition or attempt to get at this question of socioeconomic inequality, and how might we overcome them? So perhaps I go to Bill. What are the current preconditions that threaten sustainable economic growth going forward and being able to address problems such as socioeconomic inequality?
Well, there are obviously a lot of them, but I think the one that sort of worries me the most at the moment is the question of debt, and the way in which, for various reasons, we've allowed debt levels, both private debt and government debt, to build up to levels that I think are growing increasingly unsustainable. And the first priority, I think, on the private side has got to be the recognition that there's going to have to be a lot of restructuring. And that actually applies to a number of states, countries as well. I mean, we've just in the paper this morning, it looks as if Zambia is going to be looking for a restructuring. I think there's many more countries that are going to follow. There's been a huge buildup of debt by the lowest income, by the poorest countries over the course of the last 10 years in this environment of very low interest rates. So questions of restructuring, I think, are very important. One of the problems with restructuring of private debt, or for that matter, even public debt of poor countries, is that it winds up on the balance sheets of the governments of richer countries. And that's something that we're already seeing this happen. I mean, in the context of the reaction to the COVID crisis, and quite rightly too. But we must be thinking more seriously about where we go further down the line. And I'm certainly not recommending that we cut back on fiscal deficits or debt at the moment. I think that was a mistake we made in 2010 and 2011. But we should be doing what we do with some sort of thoughtfulness about what this means going forward. And so I guess it seems to me that from the financial or economic side, that government should be thinking much more seriously about borrowing much longer term at low rates than they currently are doing. They should be thinking about laying out plans for how they plan to get things back on track over time when the good times return. And they should be also making more explicit what precisely they intend to do in order to be able to achieve the goals that they've laid out. People, I think, are becoming a bit more, a bit more sophisticated, that they're not just listening to the goals that the policymakers lay out, but they want to know what are the concrete steps that people are going to take in order to achieve the goals that they've established. So those are things that I think we really need to think about doing in order to get rid of some of these preconditions. We were in a bad place before the pandemic hit. I think that's the problem.
Thank you. I would like to be able to take a number of questions coming in from the audience as well, but let's carry on for a moment on the structural barriers. Picking up from Bill, Diana, your sense of the relative role of public-private sector in getting us to net zero? Was she able to hear that question? I think we've... John, I think there's a little difficulty with Diana. We asked you the same question around the structural barriers. To what extent do you think science and innovation are at the root of the solutions to the both COVID and climate crisis, and how that should impact global policy making?
That's a good question. At risk of stating the obvious, we're at a point where we're both on COVID, climate change, and I think on the economy, where we're seeing science and technology even more in the ascendancy. I mean, I think we're all now waiting at the edge of our, not only are we more literate on the science of disease, but we're waiting on the edge of our seats. It's the scientists who are going to deliver the better testing. It's the scientists who are going to deliver the data libraries and the antibody tests, and of course it's the scientists who are going to deliver the vaccines. It's a moment. It's a scientific moment. We're in a world where when there's no risk and no threat, you can turn off science or you can turn off the experts. The moment there's a crisis, you suddenly turn to the experts. You look for solace. You look for solutions, and you look for in this case, a technological and scientific fix. It's actually this. It's in some ways, it's not the whole answer to climate change, but it is. We can't ignore the fact that it's a huge part of the answer. The WEF published an interesting paper. World Economic Forum published an interesting paper a couple of months ago, where they said that the cost of renewables is this year falling below the cost of coal-fired fossil fuels power generation. That we're not just in a world where we should be turning to renewables. We're in a world where renewables are actually, or at least have the potential to become cheaper and more efficient and a better way to produce energy than fossil fuels. And if that happens, that is a game changer. That's a massive change in the way we conduct ourselves. So this idea that, what are the barriers? The barriers are our ability to harness the power of science and technology. The barriers are our inability to share it. I mean, when you watch the US and China fighting over something like TikTok or WeChat or who's going to get the virus first, you really start to wonder about the world's ability to cooperate on not just on developing science, but sharing it. These are the barriers. I think the barriers, sadly, are political, less than technological.
Let me build on this and try and get to some wrap-up points as well. So you see, we have these wildfires on the West Coast, hurricanes and melting ice, and it's just numbing effect on the population, if you might forgive me for thinking along those lines, this apocalypse around the corner. Now, it's clear that, of course, difficult choices have to be made, and maybe try and seek out from each one of you. Diana, when navigating this health climate crisis, how should we set priorities? Any thoughts on that?
Thank you, Jatin. And sorry, I fell off on the previous one. Just briefly on the previous question, it was about linking up public and private sector. And maybe in the questions we can come into the sort of relative role of forcing change from the public sector as opposed to funding it and bringing those two sides together through in different ways. But I can come back to that if it's interesting. In terms of setting priorities, I mean, obviously we have an immediate, massive crisis, and COVID is going to dominate our thinking for a while. What we're talking about today really is trying to put sneak in the long term while we're also talking about the short term and the fact that there is actually quite a lot of intersection in those spaces. But I do think, is my contention, that when thinking about prioritization, which is clearly a huge issue, there have to be some very clear goals, and they have to be goals that are set by government in consultation with people, people in the community. And I would, again, highlight some of the citizens' assembly type approaches that have gone on in different countries where people really feel that their voices are being reflected, so that our development priorities feel like they are more congruent with the values that we hold in society. I don't think we were in that place before COVID happened. I think there was a lot of feeling that the kind of primacy of the short-term economic was out of the whack with the way people lived. I think we saw that in COVID that people cared about each other, certainly early on, that they were prepared to come together, that it wasn't an economic question. We wanted to save lives at any cost. So my argument would be that you need to think about your big goals. I personally believe that the big goals have to be climate focused, and they have to be quite concrete climate goals. Obviously, limiting warming to 2 degrees is a very clear one, but within that, there may be some specific, more granular ones for countries, and then figure out the cheapest way and most effective way and most distributionally fair way of getting there. And that's something that we can do, but we haven't typically done that. We haven't set key mission type goals for our societies. I mean, the one that we talk about a lot is, of course, the Kennedy commitment to land a man on the moon. We don't have that kind of clarity at the moment in our societies. I think we need it, and I think we then need to figure out the implementation, which was just mentioned. You know, it's great to have all these great policy goals. It was great for all these countries to commit to net zero by 2050. Do we know how they're going to get there? Absolutely not. Have they thought about that passage? Very little. So just setting a goal isn't enough. We then need to elaborate the best way to achieve it.
And is there a dramatic shift in investment priorities to get us there? Would be another angle around it. John, I'll come to you because I want to build, sense your optimism around digitalization and innovation. COVID, climate change, of course, are pushing the world together from a digitalization perspective. But then we have nationalism, tribalism, great power rivalry pulling it apart. So how might we find a global solution when international cooperation, at least as you look at it today, seems to be unraveling and no one seems to be in charge? Any thoughts on that?
Wow, that's a tough one. Great question, though. I tend to be an optimist on this question, while acknowledging that the present picture is not a pretty one, and in some ways the trends do not look good. I'm comforted by the fact, I think, that if you look at the bigger picture, if you try to analyze human history over the last 200, 300 years, it is largely a story of ever deepening and widening integration and cooperation. I mean, it's just, and across so many facets of human endeavor, not just obviously intergovernmental cooperation, but our interaction through travel, our interaction through business, our sharing of ideas, our student exchanges. We are a far more integrated world. And of course, it's largely a function of the technologies we created. So it brings us back to this question of, technology being both a force for good and a force for concern. What strikes me about the present politics, and I see it in my organization, the World Trade Organization, but I see it elsewhere, fear feeds on fear. Tribalism feeds on tribalism. Zero-sum politics, I win, you lose, feeds on zero-sum politics. My hope is a rationalist one. My hope is that people soon realize, if they haven't realized already, that this leads nowhere. There is no positive rational outcome from an increasingly nationalistic world. There is certainly no positive outcome from a decoupled world. I think it's fantasy land to think that the United States and China could wage a trade war or a technology war and then turn around and have a boundless cooperation on climate change. That climate change and other issues will be a casualty of that conflict. And I want to harken back something that Diana said that I totally agree with. I think what we need are projects that accentuate our commonalities, not our differences. Right now, we have a political discourse that zeroes in and focuses on our differences. And the commonalities, in my experience, including in the trade area, but also clearly in climate change, clearly in COVID, far outweigh the differences. What's preoccupying people in Shanghai is what is preoccupying people in London, is what is preoccupying people in Toronto. We are not that different. We're really not that different at all. And what's missing right now is, I think as Diana kind of puts it, is a kind of a global projet de société, something that we can all line up behind. Hopefully, COVID was going to be that. We're not there yet. Hopefully, climate change can.
Thank you for that sharp and clear view, John. If I may, Bill, what future developments or shocks, let's call them, that might pose still further threats to sustainable growth? I'm thinking economic growth from your perspective.
Well, I sort of hesitate to come in at this late stage because the climate is literally and metaphorically gloomy enough. But I think it would be unwise to close our eyes to the future challenges, things that are still unfolding. I think the most important thing, and I'd welcome the views of others, this COVID thing is not going to go away. And there's been so much of a presumption, that it will go away, that science somehow will deal with it. Unless the science does deal with it, my understanding of the epidemiological studies going back to the 1920s is this thing will continue until you get to herd immunity, which means this thing could be around for a long period of time. And starting off with the assumption that we have a semi-permanent problem here would be part of the way to getting a realistic solution. So that's something that really concerns me. Associated with that COVID thing too is we are already witnessing huge changes in relative prices. So just to point the finger at one of them, commercial real estate, people starting to work from home, values of buildings going down. Something like 60% of all the debt in the world is collateralized with property prices. And so if you get a big change in relative prices, this is going to be another big challenge that we're going to have to adapt to. A lot of things on the supply side of the economy that basically imply that growth is likely to go down rather than go up. Now, in certain respects, that's a good thing, one might say, from the environmental perspective. But of course, if growth is somehow required in order to pay interest on debts and all that sort of stuff, the big demographic changes imply that the world's growth potential is going down, not up. Now, as I say, the other side of it is probably good for the environment. But from the narrower, shorter term economic perspective, this is a challenge that we've got going down the line. The environmental thing in itself, I think, is going to be have unambiguously sort of negative consequences. I mean, if we go to 1.5, we go to 2, we go to 2.5, you're starting to talk now about adaptation costs that are going to be very, very large. And the last thing, of course, and this gets back to the thing that both John and Diana were talking about, was the fundamental problem is political. The great economist Schumpeter was once asked, what's the fundamental insight about economics? And his response was politics, politics, politics. And in the end, that's what it all comes down to. And I am worried, I shared John's concerns that what we've seen thus far has been polarizing, and that there's a kind of set of positive feedback processes that are going on here that will make things worse, not better. Having said that, I think both John and Diane sort of gave some positive sort of spin on the fact that maybe we will, as individuals and as states, realize that we are absolutely all in this together. And we either hang together or we, as Ben Franklin said, or we'll all hang separately. That may eventually get through. That the sort of the Marshall McLuhan global village thing may actually be a force for good as opposed to a force for evil. But the question is, what steps can you take at the political level to make that happen? And there, I don't feel in any way expert.
I thank you all for wonderful discussion up to this point. We'll try and wrap this up in about 10 minutes or so now, but I'd like to pick up a few questions coming in from our audience, and any one of you may wish to respond to that, and then we will try and close the session in about 10 minutes or so. One question from a member in the audience is: Are there line of sight opportunities to link together actions on climate, economy, COVID that might garner much more widespread buy-in, let's call it? Any thoughts? Anybody would like to touch on that?
Hmm.
Can I, sorry, is it just a free for all? I can start.
Sure, Diana.
I mean, there's been a lot of work done on some of the key priorities that can help save jobs right now and be green. So I would refer the questioner to some more detailed studies, but about clean infrastructure, things like CO2 pipelines for carbon capture, home retrofits, which are extremely jobs intensive, and nature, kind of nature basic protection of natural environments, and possibly bringing in kind of youth core of nature protectors and things like that. So there's been a lot of work done on things that are very, can unroll jobs very quickly on the ground, and be long-term good. So yes, I think that stuff is out there. I don't think that we have done enough in that space. And if you look, there's some interesting trackers on how much of the stimulus is committed to green measures and how much is committed to sort of brown measures. And it's not enough on the green side. And despite all those opportunities, I think in Canada, it's, I've got the figures here, Canada, out of there's 12 billion committed in the energy area to fossil fuel measures and only 3 billion to green energy measures. So we haven't been taking advantage of them.
Thank you, Diana. And Bill wants to come in, but Bill, I also have a question for you that fits with the audience member asking. Is it really adequate to focus on costs and disruptions of adapting to climate change and pandemics only? Should we look at the same time on the costs and disruptions we'll be faced with if we do not adapt in time? So that's an interesting question. If we just, the cost of not adapting in time. So that's perhaps, Bill, you might wish to, but you had raised your hand to answer a question as well, Bill.
Yeah. Yeah, the question of the COVID response and a green future, I just make 3 quick points. One, if governments are going to spend a lot of money, as indeed they have done, more emphasis should have been put on infrastructure and green outputs. Second point is that the support that governments are giving to firms should be much, and I understand the urgency with which this has been done, but they should be very wary about giving support to firms that are not zombies today, but could well be zombies in the kind of greener world we want. So, and the third point is that the longer this COVID thing goes on, the more the support should be for people and job training and that range of territory, as opposed to money that's spent to save jobs that may or may not be sustainable in the future. So there's a lot of things that can be done on that front. On the issue about the costs of climate mitigation versus the costs of climate adaptation, I think it's too late, from what I can see, to say we must just focus on climate mitigation. I think, in fact, there's going to be a lot of damage done by global warming in particular, to say nothing of all the other stuff, the coral reefs and whatever. And we're going to have to find ways to cope with both of those things. And as I said before, that will not be easy against the backdrop of the policy preconditions that we came into this thing with. But it's a challenge we'll have to rise to.
I have one more for John here. In fact, I have a question for you. On the subject of green bonds, do you think that's part of the answer? And you also wanted to comment as well.
I'm going to try to answer both those cycles of questions. I wanted to first point to reference that earlier question, which I think was dead on. I mean, if we have learned anything from COVID, it's the longer you delay and avoid the choices, the worse and more expensive it gets. I mean, certainly in the case of COVID, it's exponential. You wait a week, you wait 2 weeks, you wait a month, and suddenly the problem is out of control. In a sense, it's going to be a parallel situation with climate change. I think the markets and the world public opinion, all the things we discussed today, are shifting, and probably more rapidly than we recognize. It's not a question of whether you change, at what speed you change. All of these programs and ideas that Bill and Diana mentioned are in effect helping people to adjust to something that is inevitable. I don't think it's a question if it's going to happen. And I think the second point, I agree with Bill entirely about reinforcing the politics. People don't change unless there's something in it for them to change. I mean, some stake in a positive outcome. If you don't give them a stake in a positive outcome, you can expect resistance. And we see this in so many areas of public policy already, including COVID. The question about green bonds, I'm not an expert on this area, but I do think that the questioner has an important point to make. In the end, what I find most frustrating in the debate about it happens in COVID and the economy, but it also happens in climate and the economy. We have this dichotomous debate. It's a binary debate. It's always climate or the economy. It's markets or the environment. I see, with the right incentives, and especially the right financial incentives, markets are not just extraordinarily powerful engines of change. They're indispensable. You're not going to get the changes you want unless they're at some level market oriented. It's naive to think otherwise. And I think we have a lot of evidence that this combination of innovation and market powered change is happening. The financial element is a key part of that, the investment element. But this is not a question of either or.
Thank you. I'll take this one last question from a member of the audience, which I thought was interesting. So the panelists, what do you expect from the throne speech today? Now I know, John, you're in Geneva, so.
Is it what we expect or what we would like to see?
A bit of both, let's say.
I mean, I would love to see some clarity around, as I mentioned before, kind of clear objectives. My one, if I could have one policy objective for this country right now, it would be to have 100% green energy or non-emitting energy across the board. We're closer than any developed nation, or we're closer than most nations to achieving that with all the hydro, etc. We are in a really good position. If we just could reach for the stars and go for 100%, imagine what that would do to stimulate the rest of the economy and make that a kind of brand name Canada. We don't emit, and therefore we can roll out electric cars. We can do everything. So that's what I'd like to see. I don't think we'll be seeing it though.
Thank you for a sharp one, Bill and or John, on the question of what would you expect from the throne speech, or would like to see from the throne speech.
I by no means an expert on these issues, but I guess what I would say is that it seems to me that in Canada we do face a fundamental political problem which has got its roots in regional differences. And what I would hope is that we find some means, like Diana would want, to sort of move to a greener future in Canada, but in a way that manages to bring all of the regions along with us.
That's a good thought. John?
I'm going to make an unpopular observation here. I hope it's a throne speech that unsettles people and sends a few shockwaves through the body politic. I think we're susceptible in Canada to governments that tell us what we want to hear, about how wonderful we are and how the future is Canada and the world needs more Canada and we're doing great. And I don't think we are doing great. And I think a dose of realism would be very helpful here, including on the stuff the kind of thing that Diana spoke about. Transitioning is not easy. We had the Public Policy Forum had a wonderful paper by our former governor of the central bank, where he points out that oil exports, fossil fuel exports right now in Canada, not only are you running a deficit on that account, but fossil fuel exports cover all our consumer imports, all of our vacations, all of our sort of services overhangs. The idea that we can, seamlessly and painlessly and all very comfortable transition out of that, I think, is a mirage. That doesn't mean we can't, but we need a wake-up call.
No, thanks for that point. It's David Dodge's paper that
Right.
sharpens that point quite clearly. Let's begin to wind down now. This is my last question to you, and it'll be a short one. We have a number of global policymakers in our audience today, and so if I ask you the question, what would be some final considerations which you might leave with them? Perhaps a minute or so. Diana, I'll begin with you.
So one of the reasons why I'm not a policymaker is I think that I'm too impatient. So maybe what I'm going to propose isn't realistic, but I think what we see at the moment is an unprecedented opening of what's called the Overton window. So the range of possible policy options has widened massively. People are in a state of shock. They are seeing change. And I think what we absolutely need to do is to grab that moment. And there are many, many low-hanging fruit that have been just like on the back burner for years. I wish there could be like a day of just kind of running through all those sort of minor activities, and then a recognition that government behavior, and government has a monopoly on that regulation. No one else can do that, and they need to use that tool extremely well. And when you see examples of where that's worked extremely well, so if you take the ban on incandescent light bulbs, which everyone threw up their hands about, but happened and hasn't damaged us because they gave us a time period. There was innovation, and we all, it turns out that we can live with LED lights. It's not a tragedy. Let's have more of that, more kind of considered windows for making changes, which offer companies and individuals and municipalities the opportunity to create their own relevant solutions to these problems, but with a clear end goal. Thank you.
Specific bold steps. John.
My second unpopular comment of the day. I'm reminded of this H.G. Wells, his famous quotation that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. And if I could make a plea, it's for Canadian policymakers to focus on education, and especially education about the external world, and especially about rising Asia. None of the things we're talked about today are going to happen without voters agreeing to it, and voters are not going to agree to it unless they understand and want to do it. And a lot of that is just a question of enlightenment and being educated about the choices and what's in front of us. It sounds like a banal response, but I think it's fundamentally true. And we convince ourselves in Canada that we are a highly educated society, and that we are firmly on top of these debates and these issues. I don't think we are. I'm not saying that we're far behind, but we can do a better job of this. And I'm especially struck, we didn't really get into it today, but regardless of how the world plays out over the next several decades, the center of gravity is shifting to Asia. I go to China and I run into kids who are learning English every weekend, who have spent years abroad, if not many years abroad, studying in Britain, Canada, and the United States. They know far more about us than we know about them. My children want to study Renaissance literature in Florence. They are not going to Shanghai or Beijing to learn Mandarin and to learn about that the new frontier. So mine would be a plea for education.
Thank you. A good sharp point to be open to the world and its possibilities, as opposed to a blinkered view within ourselves. And particularly on Asia, I think you might recall our ambassador to China, Dominic Barton, just made that same point. Don't yet give up on China, notwithstanding the current challenges. So Bill, you have a thought.
Well, I guess I'm just going to follow up on the points that John and Diana have made. John reminded me of the quote from H.G. Wells, of one from John Kenneth Galbraith, who said a number of years ago, "Politics is not the art of the possible. It's choosing between the unpalatable and the disastrous." And as John remarked earlier on, we've had a long tradition in Canada and in many other countries as well of basically playing down the unpalatable and therefore opening the way for truly disastrous solutions. It's always short-term thinking because people get elected 4 years later. And the principal change that has to take place at the level of the politicians is they've got to focus on the fact that the path is disastrous and we have to take really significant changes, make significant changes to get off that path. And I hope Diana's right in suggesting that maybe we do have a window of that sort at the moment. This is the fundamental issue. I'm reminded, it was at Jean-Claude Juncker, you may remember a number of years ago. I think this was in the context of the great financial crisis. He said, of course we know what we should do. What we don't know is how to get elected after we do it. So the important thing is you've got to bring the people along with you to give them a clear understanding of what they have to gain, or perhaps even more importantly, what they have to lose if we don't make the changes that are required. So it's politics, politics, politics. We've got to change the mindset. And the mindset of the politicians has got to be directed towards changing the mindset of the population.
Thank you for that compelling and clear direction and perspective. I can't thank you enough, panelists, for a very compelling, timely, informative session. Of course, a recorded version of this will be made through the Balsillie and Ditchley websites. And I also, members of the audience, thank you for joining us today. Do take care and stay safe. And now I'll turn over to Anne Fitzgerald to bring the session to an end. Anne?
Thanks so much, Jatin. And just to reiterate your words, huge thanks to our eminent panelists for a hugely informative and a very compelling discussion today. I'm sure the audience will agree that it was extremely worthwhile as an hour and a quarter of real intersectional, intellectual analysis. So thank you for sharing your views. We welcome you back for our next critical conversations. On behalf of Ditchley Foundation and the Balsillie School, take care and stay safe.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.